5-minute presentation by our speakers, followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions and answers between the presenters and the participants. Also, please be aware that we'll announce the next webinar at the end of this session, as we are generally following a monthly schedule. Next slide, please. So some housekeeping items. Before we get started, just to familiarize yourself with the go-to meeting screens, there's an attendee control panel where you can control the audio for the webinar. You can use audio through your computer and speakers or telephone if you have a telephone line, and can consult the directions in the audio pane on how to do those. During the presentation, you can type questions that you want to ask the speakers later, and you can use the questions pane for that. As the moderator during the Q&A time, I'll read the questions to the presenters so that everyone can hear them clearly. Also, I want to note that all attendee phone lines are on mute already to cut out some background noises and other distractions. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording following the webinar. We ask you to take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop out at the end of the webinar. This will help us when planning future events. Also, if you're on Twitter and you'd like to tweet about today's webinar, please use the hashtag SWSwebinar. Next slide, please. Okay, about the presenter. Our first presenter is Jan Květ. He's a well-known ecologist who has worked in the field of wetlands ecology. He has spent a lot of time and effort on organizing both national and international wetland-related research and conservation activities. He graduated in plant anatomy and physiology from Charles University in 1956, and he got his Ph.D. in botany from the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences in 1964. He turned to working on freshwater plants and wetlands in 1965, gradually expanding his duties to the ecosystem level. His interests are not limited to only the study of wetland plant communities, but also include human impacts on wetlands in a broader sense. He was co-founder of the Wetlands Work Group with the International Biological Program, which was later transformed into Intercol's Wetlands Work Group. Also, for most of his professional life, he was employed by the Czechoslovak Academy's Sciences Institute of Botany. His present part-time appointments are at the University of South Bohemia and the Czech Academy of Sciences, both of which are in the Czech Republic. He has served on numerous international and national committees, starting with the IBP through Intercol and Scope to UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Program, and with the Ramsar Convention. His merits in scientific research, university teaching, and civic nature conservation-oriented activities has been acknowledged both nationally and internationally. He is a recipient of the International Fellowship Award, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award, and a life member of SWS. In 2008, he was awarded the recognition of excellence by the Ramsar Convention. The University of South Bohemia honored him by bestowing the title of Doctor Honoris Causa on him in 2013. In the same year, the Czech Academy of Sciences awarded him with the J.G. Mendel Memorial Medal for merits in biological sciences. Next slide, please. Hanna Chiskova is a former student of Jan's. Trained as a plant physiologist, she devoted her professional career to processes in wetland plants, plant stands, and ecosystems. She's especially interested in various forms of human impacts on wetlands, mainly eutrophication. Since 2005, she's been employed at the University of South Bohemia as a faculty of agriculture, where she lectures introductory courses in plant physiology, plant ecology, and advanced courses of plant ecophysiology and wetland ecology. She was among Czech wetland experts who stressed the need of integration of wetlands in the intensively managed agricultural landscapes. She is one of the leading personalities among Czech wetland experts who are promoting the integration of wetlands into those extensively managed landscapes. Next slide, please.
Hello, this is Jan Květ. I'm very glad to be able to talk to you. And before I'll be talking for a while, and then Hannah will take over from me. And at the end, I'll just finish the presentation briefly. The whole presentation is based on the conclusions of a conference that we had in České Budějovice. The German name of this place is Budejovice in the Czech Republic in October. And there were as many as 170 or more participants from 20 countries, most of them European countries, but about 6 non-European countries were also represented. And if you want to learn more about the conference, just visit the conference website, the address of which is presented here. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. The venue of the conference was the capital of South Bohemia, České Budějovice, and as you can see, here is the ancient center of the city. And what may interest especially you in North America is that the original Budweiser beer comes from here. The yeast and all the skill for making beer in St. Louis was transported from here in the 19th century. Next slide. The conference had seven sessions of different lengths, each dealing with a separate topics as they are listed here on the screen. And our presentation will follow the same structure as you can see here. Please, okay. The first section dealt with water and climate, and our view of climate effects of wetlands was mainly that the function which wetlands exercise by cooling the climate, because the presence of water, and that means also the water in wetlands, reduces temperature amplitudes, which is common experience, and the mechanism behind it is evapotranspiration. That means evaporation from the plants, from the water surface, and also from the wet soil. And of course, for this evaporation, a lot of energy is consumed. The energy comes from the sun, and instead of heating just the air around, as it happens, for instance, on a concrete pavement, here the energy is spent on evaporating the water, which then condenses and releases the energy somewhere else, usually high in the atmosphere. And actually, not only wetlands, but any well-developed permanent green vegetation can accomplish this role, provided the vegetation is well supplied with water. So that we think that the maximized retention of water in soil helps recover the water regime and also helps mitigate the excessive heat waves which are nowadays associated with the climate change. Next slide, please. This is a picture which shows you a wet meadow, a wetland around the place where I work, and the yellow arrow shows the input of net solar radiation into the meadow. The orange arrow depicts the so-called sensible heat flux, which is the flux of heat which warms up the atmosphere. The G arrow at the bottom of the slide shows the amount of heat that warms up the ground, and the blue arrow is the amount of energy spent on evaporating the water. And by and large, if you compare the two most important fluxes upwards from, that means the blue arrow and the orange arrow, so that if the ratio between the sensible heat flux and the evapotranspiration, the evaporative flux of energy, is less than 1, that means that the wetland is cooling the area quite sufficiently. That's the Bowen ratio on the left. And we have a tool which can show us very easily and in a quick way how this evapotranspiration affects the surface temperatures of different objects. On the left you have standard pictures of the wet meadows. One is a drained one and the other is undrained. And then you can see that according to the scales of temperature by the spectral colors on the right, that the drained meadow is overheated on a summer day. The tree which has probably closed its stomata in the leaves also evaporates only little, so that the color is not very much changed from the yellow or red one. Whereas at the bottom, this undrained meadows spends most of the energy, incoming energy, on evapotranspiration, and only the boardwalk is heated up, so that you can see quite clearly in the thermovision what are the approximate temperatures. Next one, please. If you compare this wet meadow with a cornfield, for instance, and if you take a picture with the thermovision camera, you see how the ground in the cornfield is overheated, so that even though the leaves are still transpiring a little, but very often, as you know, they wilt and don't transpire on a hot summer day, especially at midday. So then this is a kind of situation which is quite common in many agricultural areas. And if you place wetlands strategically into these areas, they can milden the microclimate or mesoclimate around the wetland to quite appreciable distances. Next slide, please. Now, the next section of the conference dealt with wetland biodiversity. And of course, in agricultural landscapes is the agricultural practices that are important for the management of diversity. And we have traditional practices which can be, if carried out properly, environment friendly, can also promote the biodiversity. But sometimes we have, or quite often actually, we have to restore the wet meadows or other wetland areas by increasing the water supply to them. And what is quite interesting in agricultural areas, and also with water bodies where the water level fluctuates, that the periodic flooding or disturbances create conditions that are favorable for the occurrence of some species, that especially plant and insect and other invertebrate species, but even bird species, that for which these conditions of the relatively dry period of the wetland are favorable. So, and these plants and even insects are not very competitive, so that this practice of having bare wet ground in a field helps them survive. Next slide, please. Yeah, the wetland uses that are compatible with biodiversity preservation are shown here. A traditional one is reed harvesting, which is still carried out in different parts of Europe and Asia, like the Danube Delta, for instance. Common is the hay drying on alluvial meadows, and floodplain forests are among the most productive forests of the temperate zone, as you know. In the American terminology, they would be called bottomland, either hardwood or softwood forests. Fish farming in fish ponds is a very important business in some parts of Europe, especially for cultivation of carp, and it's also considered to be an agricultural activity. And in the recent times, more and more soft recreation, including also bird watching, is carried out in wetlands. Next slide, please. Next. Here is an illustration of how the water table fluctuations support the biodiversity by providing alternating conditions, dry and wet, for the life of different wetland plant life forms. And it is especially, here it's illustrated by two examples. And in the next slide, you will see how some very rare plants can survive in fields that have been flooded for a certain period of time. Next slide, please. You see here we have a dry or almost dry, in this case it's a fish pond mud, but on a smaller scale it also occurs in fields, and if you have clay soil, you get even fissures in the soil. On sandy soil this doesn't happen, and these plants which grow on the surface of either the sandy or the clay soil, a good many of them have a high conservation value. They are among the endangered species. Next slide, please. Now, paludiculture, that's perhaps an unusual word for you. It means either agri or silvicultural use of re-wetted peatlands, but also other wetlands. And the reasons for cultivating plants on wet ground are especially twofold. One is that reduces, the flooding reduces the mineralization of organic matter, which occurs very quickly in drained organic soils. And the second reason is that the paludiculture promotes water retention in the landscape. And the energy crops like grasses, for instance, phalaris, reed grass, reed canary grass, are among those traditional paludiculture crops. But in the next slide, in the next few slides, I will deal with potential agricultural crops that could be cultivated in wetlands. The next slide, please. Next slide, I count. Why do we need these temperate wetland crops? We know that wetlands and shallow waters offer traditionally various products of agricultural nature. The most important is, of course, rice. But in the temperate zone, our agriculture is based mainly on steppe grasses, which come and not on wetland plants like rice. And in order to retain water in the landscape, we should avoid drainage of agricultural soil as much as possible, and we need crops that will be tolerant of waterlogging at least, if not even shallow flooding. So we don't have such crops yet that would be economically effective and energetically as well. So we need really to breed new crops or from potential starting genotypes. And one of the main reasons is what I talked about in the microclimate section, and that's the maintenance of a restoration of a humid mesoclimate and soil moisture content to keep it high, because unnecessary drainage and water runoff is becoming more and more dangerous in view of the gradual climate change in the temperate zone towards higher summer temperatures. Next slide, please. In North America, next slide, please. In North America, the prospective wetland cereal crop is Indian rice, which is already harvested, but only Native Americans are so far allowed to harvest it, as far as I know. And the collection of this of the seeds, or caryopsis, correctly speaking, is very tedious and complicated and time-consuming. Next slide, please. The next slide. Zizania Indian rice could be used, I suppose, as a genetic source for breeding something like a rice for the temperate zones, especially in North America and East Asia, where species of Zizania are native. Outside their native ranges, especially in Eurasia, one would have to be cautious about potential invasiveness of the plants, and we may look for other plants. And of course, what is still a drawback is that the panicles can still fragment and don't remain compact when the caryopsis become ripe. The next slide, please. So for Eurasia, we envisage a somewhat different crop, and a potential starting point could be the cereal Cockspur, which is, or cereal millet, which was put into cultivation in India. But I made some experiments with it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. At our place in Central Europe, at an altitude of about 400 meters in a cool climate, and after sowing the plants in waterlogged boxes with soil at the end of May or beginning of June, we still got ripe caryopsis in late October. So I suppose that even under conditions of a temperate climate, some good result might be obtained with this cereal Cockspur, because this is already a cultivar, not a wild growing plant, and the panicles, the inflorescences, remain compact when the seeds are ripe. And now I'm handing over to Hannah for the next sections of our presentation and also of the conference I mentioned.
Hello, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be in contact with you and to let you know about other sections of our conference. The fourth topic was called Abatement of Agriculture Pollution. The reason for it is quite straightforward, because wetlands occur on the interface between land and water, and therefore they intercept soil particles, dissolved mineral nutrients, as well as all kinds of chemical pollutants from the adjacent agricultural land. Of course, this is something unwanted when we try to care of pristine nutrient pool wetlands, and therefore we try to divert this pollution from them. On the other hand, there are quite a few sites that are not so, I would say, not so unique and still can provide a service for us. In the section that focused on the nutrient pollution and the possibility how wetlands can cope with it, it was concluded that the scientific evidence is ample and we can well build on it. The constructed wetlands of all sorts that are known are found useful tools for retention of nutrients. Most experience comes from point sources. I'll come to it later. Yes, as far as the pesticides, there are some preliminary scientific studies, but only limited information is available for full-scale studies on either created or constructed wetlands, so it's difficult to draw any conclusions for practice so far. Well, next slide, please. Thank you. One option for nutrient retention that is well known as buffer strips along banks and shores of running and standing waters. This is a classical concept of nutrient retention, and as you can see on the graph, its efficiency largely depends on the width of the buffer strip. The red line that is laid at the 5-meter width of the buffer strip indicates the width of the buffer zone that is compulsory for farms in Europe getting subsidies from the European Union. It's quite obvious that we would rather need larger buffer strips. But to our knowledge, the wider buffer zones are not widespread in Europe so far. On the other hand, the large areas of wetlands working on the same principle have been introduced along the coast of Baltic Sea, which is the largest hypoxic zone at the coast of Europe. And the aim of these constructed wetlands is to reduce the load of nitrate to the Baltic Sea. Next slide, please. Here is a nice example of a treatment using, well, originally this is treatment of point source nutrient pollution coming from a farmyard in Ireland. The principle is a cascade of small surface flow wetlands overgrown with emergent macrophytes. We would call it perhaps ponds also. And the important point is that there are more of such ponds, one beneath the other. And the first one that is depicted on the left receives the sewage or untreated polluted water, and the polluted water then comes from one of those ponds to another, and you can see on the series of these pictures how each of the subsequent ponds looks better and better. And on the last slide, there is the author and promoter of those so-called integrated constructed wetlands, Dr. Rory Harrington of Ireland, and demonstrates a glass of water which is as clean as tap water. I guess that he did not drink it in front of us. Anyway, this principle of the point source, of this treatment of point source pollution can also be used over catchments. And this is, if all those small water bodies are positioned along water courses. And one of such most elaborate systems occurs in Sweden. It includes a whole variety of usually small water bodies in all reaches of waters, and it's also monitored in a well designed and detailed manner. Yes, the next slide, please. Yes, nutrient stripping by harvesting plant biomass or even sometimes fish biomass is not new as an idea, but so far it has not been used very widely because we didn't have the necessary well-developed follow-up technology, including harvesting, processing, and economic analysis. But nowadays, these problems are studied by North German colleagues of Greifswald University around Professor Josten and Dr. Wendelin Wichtmann, and also in parallel by Richard Grosshans and co-workers of the International Institute of Sustainable Development. So currently the whole production chain, including economic analysis, is available at the pilot scale and looks very promising. Next slide, please. So we are coming to the next session of the conference, which was focused on wetland restoration and creation. In this topic, we are largely focused on restoration of previously high-value wetlands and creation of wetlands that look near-natural. That means we are not talking about constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment. The conference concluded that there is sufficient knowledge and skills available, but there are various obstacles when this knowledge and skills should be put into practice. One of them is that we always need to have clear goals and success criteria when evaluating the projects submitted. And we always need to bear in mind that we are not trying to return the wetland to its original state, but the realistic aim can only be rehabilitation of acceptable habitat condition. We never create the wetlands that was there prior to human impact. Also, many participants stressed that it is very important to include costs of the monitoring program in the cost of the project, even though the monitoring program should be proceeding for many longer. Next slide, please. Next. Thank you. Well, I guess much is known about restoration of wetlands of high quality for biodiversity purposes. So today I will be showing you some pictures of sites that also, well, these sites in the Šumava Mountains that occur on the southern border between the Czech Republic bordering to Germany and Austria. They are also valuable as far as species diversity is concerned, but also they are that there are also reservoirs of well, there are sites that first intercept rainwater in our geographic area. From there, the water flows downstream. So, as is well known, the European countries from Central Europe up to down to Southern Europe all either suffer from or will be suffering from greater droughts and lack of water. So it's important to retain water from the utmost reaches of the streams and rivers. So this is one example how it is done using wooden bars across the formerly drainage ditches. Next slide, please. Next, please. Oh, thank you. The following, this picture also shows you a similar example. This time it is the restoration of small river called Stropnice River, which was formerly channelized and is restored, was restored last year. You can see clearly how the length of the water course gets prolonged. It's usually 1.5 fold longer. Next slide, please. Thank you. One example from South European country, which is Spain. Wetlands are created there. There is an initiative promoted by Professor Francisco Comín, who organizes or coordinates creation of wetlands on streams that receive outflowing irrigation water, again with the aim to retain water in landscape for a longer period of time. Next slide, please. Then one example of a, say, tricky situation. We face areas that were formerly drained for agriculture, but then again waterlogged or inundated. It could be either smaller areas around clogged or blocked drainage ditches and drainage tubes. When these drainage systems cannot be repaired anymore, or there are whole large areas on sites with organic soil which was drained and then subsided so much that it cannot be drained anymore. So in these situations, on one hand, we can be happy that we have more water in landscape and we have more wetlands, but we should be aware that from these areas we can get unwanted release of methane, then phosphorus, and perhaps hazardous agricultural chemicals. Next slide, please. So we are coming to an end of the conference, to two very short sections that concerned humans as related to wetlands. Session number 6 was focused on legislation and policy, and was not so much scientific or more about sharing organization experience, how experience about the large whole European activities and environmental and conservation activities and large restoration projects. So it was agreed that a holistic approach that would enable more understanding between legislative and executive institutions would be very welcome. But then, though it seems to be sometimes somewhat idealistic, but the next point that the European Union funding programs should be matched or supplemented with national programs. This is realistic and is also quite frequent. Again, clear objectives and goals, and as mentioned before, and one important point for practice, that the projects should allow medium-term continuity. That means at least 5 years. On the next slide, you can see an example of the European Union program that funds such restorations, including wetlands. Its acronym is LIFE. It comes from French, L'Instrument Financier pour l'Environnement. In English, it would be Financial Instrument for the Environment. It was launched in 1992, and wetlands are among the habitat types that are most frequently targeted by this LIFE program. About 400 projects have been targeted as concerns the wetland biodiversities, or both the diversity of wetland habitats and also bird species, according to the legislation of the European Union. And more than other 1,000 projects have addressed water quality and water level. On the slides that you can see, there are examples of such projects. You see that they really focus on various aspects of water management and use. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, and the last session concerned stakeholders or people that are in some relation with wetlands. This picture aims at showing that there are many groups of stakeholders and they differ in their interests. The first and most important, of course, are farmers that live on agriculture, and also agriculture is their main interest. Then local communities that can also consist of farmers, at least partly, may have slightly different interests, and this is harmonious surroundings, nice surrounding for living. Then the non-governmental institutions who take activities in nature, in the care of nature and environment, but also can carry out various outdoor activities. And last but not least, of course, governmental institutions who takes care of nature conservation and so on. So many stakeholders groups which sometimes find it difficult to understand each other. I mentioned farmers, but I should perhaps stress that the conference had some nice examples how NGOs can be useful in wetlands management by using the enthusiasm and voluntary work of the participants. This concerned the care of streams that in which some fish, trouts were not cultivated but occurred naturally. Okay, one perhaps not new but really important point is the great conflict of interest. Your next slide, yes, please. Yes, conflict of interest between small local stakeholders and strong or big stakeholders. Local stakeholders, as you can see on the left-hand side, are usually local people and people who are who carry out their activities directly on the locality, while the strong stakeholders usually manage larger areas, and it is possible that they seldom visit this small locality. So there is a study by Francisco Comín of Spain that stresses this controversy and shows how the rural communities depend more in the quality of their lives on the ecosystem services that are provided by the local ecosystems and local agricultural land. But these local inhabitants and small farms usually do not control the land or landscape manager at a larger scale. That means they do not control which ecosystem services, to what extent and in what quality would be provided to them. On the other hand, the provision of those ecosystem services and goods like food production are controlled by the more organized parts of the society, starting with agribusiness, but also professional associations and last but not least also state administration. Well, from me it's all, and I hand over again the telephone to Jan Květ.
Hello, this is Jan again. As you probably realize, we are approaching the end of our presentation, and at the end I would like to draw your attention to a few questions which may not be in direct relationships to the contents of our conference, but still are quite important in relation to the question about how to ensure a fruitful coexistence of agriculture and wetlands management and conservation. So the first one is whether conservation of wetlands can preserve their valuable ecosystem services to agriculture. Here the natural answer is positive, and maybe this wouldn't be the case only in the most production-oriented services or in various extreme habitats like highly saline salt marshes or highly polluted wetlands, of course. The next question is about the compatibility of agricultural use of wetlands for growing wetland crops with the WISE, the Ramsar terminology. Nowadays we would say rather sustainable use of wetlands. And this, of course, is again, in my opinion, the answer is positive, but strictly protected areas, I think, should be saved of any use, and that's quite important. For the third question, whether agricultural use of wetlands can impair sustainable or suppress sustainable ecosystem services that wetlands provide, is no, but conditionally no. That means that the agricultural use has to maintain the ecosystem structure and functioning characteristics of natural wetlands. Their different participation in global energy flows and material cycles. And four, whether there are examples of successful cultivation of wetland fields or grassland crops in temperate regions. Yes, examples do exist, but we need really further development. We badly need it. And among the, apart from developing suitable technology, we also have to breed wetland crops that would be both economically rewarding and environmentally tolerable. Of course, all these questions and answers can be debated, and I expect you may have also questions about it, but this is really almost the end of our presentation, because in the next slide I would like to thank all those on whose information our presentation is based. They are being greeted by the ghost of our waters and wetlands, the waterman. And the last slide, in the last slide, I would just like to thank you for your attention, and not only for that, but also for your patience with our Central European accent in English. And then, if you allow me, both Johanna and me would like to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year 2016. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
All right. Thank you, Jan and Hannah, for that engaging, thought-provoking presentation. And if everyone's ready, let's open the question and answer period of our webinar. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the questions box in the drop-down control panel on the right side. If you post a question, I will reread it to Jan and Hannah so that they can hear it clearly. And if we don't have any yet, I've got a couple I could fill in.
Excuse me, I didn't hear the beginning of your question.
Oh, there's no questions popping up. There's no questions popping up yet, so I was going to ask one of my own. Can you hear me, Hannah?
Yes.
This is Jeff. I have a question of my own related to the buffer strip graphic that you showed. Is there it's currently 5 meters, it said. Is there thoughts on what it should be to be most effective based on some of the research?
Yes. Well, this is of course by too much less. It should be much more. The only example I know about that had legislation that had a larger buffer strips obligatory by legislation was Denmark, who had 12 meters, but only for 1 year or two, and then the new government abolished it. So far it's just on the decision of the landowners, and some stricter obligations concern drinking water, for instance. But yes, much has to be done to get better situation, of course. Yeah, at the legislation and administration level.
Okay. Let me see if I can. I'm trying to see if I can see any questions popping up. And I don't see any yet. All right, here's one that came up. Okay, we have a question. I'll have to expand this. Just a moment, I'm sorry. So we have a question that says other countries are also interested in stakeholder engagement in wetland restoration and conservation. Can you comment on the processes or the mechanism by which countries in Europe engage stakeholders? And these would be like interested citizens or people that live in the watershed or near the area.
Yeah. Well, just generally, there were the conference has had some case studies showing the involvement of some stakeholder groups. I already spoke about that was some fishing society of anglers, something like that, in Denmark. The Spanish study concerned the small stakeholders against the big ones. In our country, we have recently made a study concerning the attitude of agriculture managers and farmers toward wetlands. These studies being just evaluated. And yes, case studies, of course, always involve discussions of all kinds and stakeholders involved. That's necessity, and it's the same all over the world, starting with the property of the land and other rights and understanding of those various stakeholder groups and so on.
So having meetings locally, yes, with the folks affected.
Yeah, we can't do without it.
Yes, and of course also children's and youth groups,
yes,
are engaged in wetlands management in, yes, several European countries, including this country.
Okay. Here's another question I have. Are you aware of studies examining the dimensions necessary for effective water storage using something like small upstream reservoirs you showed on some of your slides? So what size? Are there any studies to determine the optimal size for those?
Yeah, well, there, in this country, a discussion is going on about the pros and cons of small reservoirs in contrast to natural or semi-natural floodplains. And there are indices that floodplains work in many respects better, and in flat areas they can retain really much water. So this doesn't mean, well, it's all calculation, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that one type of solution is better than the other, but probably we need to combine all possible types, depending on the specificity of the site.
Well, I would just add that in Hungary there was a project which I think has not yet been materialized completely, but as you know, Hungary is a flat country surrounded by the Carpathians from 3 sides, and heavy rains in the Carpathians cause floods then in the Hungarian plain, and they have planned quite a number of the so-called dry polders. That means enclosures for retaining the flood water, in which normal agriculture is carried out if there is no flood, but then the farmers are prepared that the fields may be flooded at any time, and then they would get financial compensation from the government. So
Mm-hmm.
This is also a possibility for flood control in these dry polders. And on the other hand, if there is shortage of water, again it's possible to divert a part of the main flow of the river into the polders and store the water there.
Okay, that's helpful. I don't see any other questions that have popped up yet. Oh, here's one. Is there a comprehensive plan for the Czech Republic or other European countries on which areas to rehabilitate versus an ad hoc approach? So is there an organized restoration or rehabilitation plan for each country, or for the Czech Republic specifically, or is it opportunistic and whenever the land is available to restore things?
Well, several years ago, the European Commission of the EU issued a water directive framework, which is a sort of guiding instrument or guiding blueprint for all countries of the European Union, how to treat their waters, not only from the point of view of the quantity of water retained in the countryside, but also from the quality point of view. And each member country of the EU is obliged to work out its own plans, and they have to be then approved by the European Commission. And if any country is carrying out these and then accomplishing these measures slowly or not at all, then it may have the result that some subsidies by the European Union to different projects, not only on water management but other projects too, may be withdrawn. So that this is an indirect tool in which the treatment of waters and management of waters postulated by the directive can be achieved.
All right. I think we have time for one more question, if I can read it quickly. Frequently, we see the hesitation to take land out of agricultural production for construction or restoration of wetlands due to the impact on the profit to the farmer. Do you think that in your area, farmers may be able to convert from row crop agricultural activity like the corn production to wetland agriculture and have a good trade-off or comparable profits for switching from one type of crop to another, which may be better for the ecosystem?
Well, this, of course, is still in the haze, because so far we haven't got such wetland crops that would really be comparable as far as yields and economic effect would be is concerned with traditional crops. So for the time being, this is still a theoretical question. This is still a theoretical problem, and I think that first of all, it's a task for agricultural and other scientists to breed such crops that would match at least the traditional crops in their productivity and in the marketability of the products. Of course, as I said in my part of the presentation, machinery, equipment, and so on also is being gradually developed, but still is not as perfect as it is for the dryland agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, a problem, and I think that it is our duty as scientists to do something for that.
Okay.
If I may add a bit, while Jan described nicely the situation with food crops, the situation is much better with energy crops that can be used either for biogas production or for the production of pellets, briquettes, and so on, depending on whether it's harvested in the green state or dry. And in this aspect, as I said before, it doesn't. I believe it doesn't take too long before it's used commercially.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for the. I don't see any more questions, so we'll probably have to wrap it up here. I'd like to thank you very much, Jan and Hannah, for taking the time and transmitting all this information. This is a great topic. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, you and Ali and Michel and all those who contributed to this long-distance talk with all the audience, which is predominantly in North America, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we were very pleased and honored by the opportunity to speak and show some slides and some conclusions of the conference, which really was considered to be quite, to have been quite successful by the participants. So we would like to wish again a good end of the year and Christmas, and also a good start of the new year. And let us hope that our contacts will be maintained.
Yes, that would be great. Same to you too.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to go over a couple of our upcoming webinars for those of you on the line. In January, we have Lisa Fernandez talking about climate change in the American mind, what we think, feel, do, and understand about global warming, and how wetlands professionals can speak out about it with their various constituencies. And also in February, we have Nigel Roulet and Bill Mumma talk about significance of global boreal and permafrost peatlands and wetlands as it relates to global climate change and policy approaches for protecting those areas of potential carbon sinks, carbon banks, long-term carbon banks for global change. So with that, I think we will wrap up today's webinar. Thank you, everyone, for participating.